You're in Whitby, Yorkshire, sometime in the 1890s. One of the greatest and suddenest storms on record has just been experienced here, with results both strange and unique. What was a perfectly average August day would suddenly break out into an unimaginable tempest. Before the sun dipped below the black mass of Kettle Ness, standing boldly athwart the western sky, its downward was marked by myriad clouds of every sunset colour. Flame, purple, pink, green, violet, and all the tints of gold, with here and there masses, not large but of seemingly absolute blackness, in all sorts of shapes, as well as outlined as colossal silhouettes. Local maritime folk have concluded that their vessels will not leave the harbour tonight. As you look out onto the brewing ocean, the diorama is almost completely devoid of life, with the exception of the odd fishing boat. But then you see it, standing full mast against the rising gale, a Russian schooner headed west. Efforts were made to signal her to reduce sail in the face of her danger. Before the night shut down, she was seen with sails idly flapping as she gently rolled on the undulating swell of the sea, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. And then, just as the old sea folk had anticipated, the storm bursts into life. In a very few minutes, the lately glassy sea was like a roaring and devouring monster. To be caught between the towering waves and the oppressive cliffs around them is a horrifying thought, and yet, there on the waves, as idle as it was a few hours prior, the Russian schooner remains, all sails set. The winds suddenly shift and the fog parts, as though some mad god itself is pushing the vessel towards the Whitby shore. But as the vessel nears, you come to a chilling realization. The ship is totally unmanned, save for a single corpse strapped to the helm with a piece of tackle. Word comes later that he passed some 2 days earlier, the last to die upon the doomed ship, Demeter. This is a scene from Bram Stoker's seminal gothic novel, Dracula, although if the version of myself who's editing this video has done their job correctly, you'll already know that. I think about this sequence often. I've spent a fair amount of my adult life close to the English seaside. I went to university in Cornwall with a direct view of the sea, and when it storms, you notice it. I took a trip once with a friend from Falmouth to Penzance, and I think that might be the most violent ocean I've ever seen with my own eyes. We looked out over the sheer face of the wall that divided the road from the sea, and the waves smashed into the concrete with such utter ferocity that they towered over us, soaking the cars and reaching all the way across the street to the pavement on the other side. I remember thinking about that scene from Dracula and laughing, some mix of childlike amusement at the spectacle of it all, but also a kind of nervous laughter from the unsettling realization that if I were between the waves and the concrete of the wall below, I would be crushed and swallowed up by the sea like I was nothing at all. I looked out across the horizon and pictured the doomed ship Demeter, full mast, unmanned, and dwarfed by the uncaring English Channel, both beautiful and terrifying in its sublime majesty. If you've seen the HBO animated series Scavengers Reign, this may sound familiar to you. The doomed ship Demeter, overcome by the elements, just as the Russian schooner of the same name was blasted by the waves of the shore of northern England, so too is the spacefaring colonial ship blasted by waves of radiation, a solar flare from a local sun incapacitating the vessel in seconds, leaving its few survivors stranded on an unknown planet, and leaving the fate of its cryogenically frozen human cargo unknown. Scavengers Reign isn't just the best animated show of 2023, it's the best TV show of 2023, full stop. Unfortunately, HBO did an absolutely atrocious job of marketing the show, so the chances are that you didn't even know it was a thing, let alone actually watch it. And if you're in the UK or most of Europe, you wouldn't really be able to watch it legally anyway because HBO still haven't made their platform available in those regions because they just hate money, I guess, I don't know. Nevertheless, Scavengers Reign is the kind of unusual, unique, haunting project that modern animation so sorely needs. Next to 2022's Pantheon, it represents a new life for hard science fiction that I personally find very appealing. The surviving crew of the Demeter make up the main protagonists of the series. On one hand, you have Arzi, a calculated, intelligent, but somewhat unemotional woman, accompanied by her robotic companion Levi. Together, they've converted their downed escape pod into a temporary home and farm before it too succumbs to the elements. On the other hand, you have the scientist, Ursula, and the ship's captain, Sam. Through Ursula's analytical and methodical personality and their mutual resourcefulness, the two of them have begun to make sense of the strange, beautiful planet and its labyrinthine ecosystems. And somewhere between these two parties you have Cayman, a viscerally pathetic man trapped inside his escape pod in some dense jungle, barely living before being rescued by a deeply unsettling creature with whom he forms a toxic, symbiotic relationship. This is where our story begins, and from this point forward, the goals are very simple. Number 1, they must find their way across the planet to the crash site of the Demeter, rescue its surviving cargo, and use its resources to escape the planet. And number 2, survive by any means necessary. And surviving the landscape of this planet is no easy task. You'll be immediately struck by its jarring blend of colourful, majestic alien vistas, but also the unimaginable horrors that those vistas hide. Creatures of impossible size and magnitude, spores that will cause fungi to erupt from your flesh while you're still alive, and foliage that can crush your body by pure reflex. There are organisms on this planet that will do things to your body that will bother you for days. It gets under your skin, sometimes in a literal sense. All of that is to say that the planet of Scavengers Reign is as unknowable and horrible as it is beautiful. The writers are certain to make sure that you never forget that. When I saw the Demeter for the first time in Scavengers Reign, surrounded by floating cadavers as though submerged deep beneath the sea, it naturally reminded me of the sequence from Dracula yet again. The obvious, overt connections between the two, perhaps even an intentional reference, aren't the only things that had me thinking about the doomed ship at full mast. It isn't actually until episode 5 that the specifics of the ship's demise are presented to us. Before that point, it's a total mystery. The episode begins with the ship's captain, Sam, standing atop the observation deck, staring down the star which we later discover will be the ship's end. He turns. Below him is the bizarre, beautiful, confounding nightmare of a planet which he will eventually find himself stranded on. So what's actually happening here in these two examples? Why did I choose to open this video with such a long, drawn-out description of the Whitby sequence from Dracula, and why am I lingering on this shot of all shots? What storytelling mechanisms are actually being employed here, and why? Well, first of all, you probably noticed the emphasis on natural phenomena, whether it be the vast and hostile expanse of space, or the waves of the English Channel. From this, there is an emphasis placed upon forces that are far greater than any human being. Forces to be awed and respected, but which could just as easily destroy you with utter indifference. On top of this, I would encourage you, and I hope I already have encouraged you through my descriptions, to consider the bizarre, haunting simultaneity of both beauty and fear that is captured in these two examples. Think for a second about the language used in Dracula and the imagery used in Scavengers Reign. I repeat, myriad clouds of every sunset colour: flame, purple, pink, green, violet, and all the tints of gold, with here and there masses not large but of seemingly absolute blackness, in all sorts of shapes, as well as outlined as colossal silhouettes. It paints such a gorgeous, vivid depiction of the summer sky, immediately cut through with a foreboding description of absolute blackness. Look again at this image. The star, the planet itself. They're beautiful, colourful, but they, and the enormity of space, dwarf Sam within the frame. In both these examples, you can't help but feel a tinge of being overwhelmed by this pairing of awe and acute fear. And that name, Demeter, it may sound familiar to you for completely different reasons entirely. It's a peculiar choice of name, right? Demeter. Sounds a bit Greek. Well, actually, it is Greek. Demeter belongs to the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses, and Demeter is the goddess of the harvest. She oversees the fertility of the earth and the bounty of its crops. The Demeter, as we find out later on, is a colonial vessel. It contains a colony of humans in cryostasis with the intention of proverbially sowing the seeds of civilization someplace else. Not here though, this was not where they intended to be. So much of the Scavengers' capacity to survive relies upon their ability to use the natural world to their advantage. As is the case with a harvest, a good or bad one can bring an entire people to their knees. Such is the simultaneous beauty and power of Demeter, often depicted as the very spirit of beauty, gentle and fair and calm, enshrouded in the same gold as the crops that she represents. And yet, by that same token, she also represents the dry and infertile earth, or a fickle turn in the climate that could utterly destroy the agriculture of an entire nation. The characters in Scavengers Reign are equally at the whims of a natural world that they can only hope to master but never control, one which can be as beautiful and rewarding as it can be oppressive and punishing. The show hasn't even got off the ground yet, and its themes are already being introduced to us through the name of a shipwrecked space vessel. Okay, so we've talked an awful lot about beauty and fear, how the two exist simultaneously. What's the point, what am I getting at, and how does it help us to understand Scavengers Reign? Well, in order to make sense of all of this, we need to talk about a literary idea called the sublime. And that, my friends, is exactly what I'm here to talk about today. Hello and welcome back to Curmudgeon Media. My name's Tom, and today we're going to be talking about the sublime horror of Scavengers Reign. So, if I say the word sublime, what does that conjure in your mind? What does it make you think of? There are a lot of words in the English language which mean something very different in a colloquial sense than they do in a literary sense. For example, when we call something awesome, which a lot of people do, it's a pretty common word after all, we use it pretty liberally. It's not that often that we use that word to describe something which actually inspires awe. Like to be in awe of something, a waterfall or a canyon or whatever the hell that James Webb Space Telescope's got going on. I think the word sublime fits perfectly comfortably into that category. People might describe a really nice meal as being sublime or whatever. But the sublime as a literary concept is, well, it's needlessly complicated to say the least. If I were to read the bog-standard definition of the sublime from its Wikipedia article, it's described as the quality of greatness, whether physical, moral, intellectual, metaphysical, aesthetic, spiritual, or artistic. The term especially refers to a greatness beyond all possibility of calculation, measurement, or imitation. And I think there are kernels of this definition which we'll be using going forward, particularly this overarching idea of the sublime being something so incredible, so overwhelming, that it becomes sort of transcendent. It transcends us, it transcends language, it transcends our sense of self as we're dwarfed by the crushing majesty of this thing before us, whatever it may be. But the sublime, as it's continued to exist as an idea over the course of hundreds of years, has been debated, picked apart, disagreed upon, and mutated between the many writers and philosophers who've taken interest in it. So, for the sake of making a video that doesn't take me a year to finish and 3 hours to watch, we need to kind of limit our focus here. We need to be specific on the kind of sublime that we're talking about. For this video, we're going to be primarily talking about the sublime as it appears in Gothic art and literature. Scavengers Reign is, after all, a sci-fi horror, and as we'll unpack over the rest of this video, it uses a lot of ideas outlined in the Gothic sublime to create its weird, beautiful, horrifying world. One of the earliest definitions of the sublime comes from a Roman philosopher called Longinus, as translated by Nicolas Boileau in 1674. The sublime is a certain power of discourse which is calculated to elevate and to ravish the soul, and which comes either from grandeur of thought or from magnificence of words. Simon Morley writes that Longinus had declared that true nobility in art and life was to be discovered through a confrontation with the threatening and unknown, or that which challenges our capacity to understand and fills us with wonder. We're talking about things which affect us through their sheer magnitude and our incapacity to completely comprehend them. I think back to the seawall in Penzance, and it's easy to understand how these ideas are often paired with nature. In his book on the Gothic sublime, Vijay Mishra suggests that nature arouses a sense of the sublime through astonishment. With that in mind, let's take a look back over those examples that we brushed over from Dracula and Scavengers Reign. Bram Stoker's choice to bombard the reader with a slurry of adjectives to describe the sky, its incomprehensible mishmash of colours. In many ways, this overabundance of descriptive terms seems like an attempt at compensation for something which defies description. And then, as the storm breaks out, the lately glassy sea transforms into a roaring and devouring monster. What Stoker's trying to do here is capture in words the feeling of inadequacy when presented with the force of nature, something which Scavengers Reign achieves in a single image. This is where we start to enter the territory of another prolific writer on matters of the sublime, Immanuel Kant. According to Morley, Kant's philosophizing of the sublime captured the independence of nature, whose sheer complexity and grandeur continuously exceeds any human ability to control or understand it. So there's a dialogue at play here between man, the subject, and nature, the sublime. Something I find truly fascinating about Scavengers Reign is that one of its chief inspirations is, and stick with me here, survivalist YouTube videos. Specifically, the YouTube channel Primitive Technology served as a particular point of influence for Joe Bennett and Charles Huttner in how they depicted the characters making sense of this hostile new environment. This seems kind of contradictory, at least at first. I mean, if we take a look at any one of these videos, they capture a very different kind of relationship between man and nature than some struggle to control something which can't be controlled. This guy, aptly named John Plant, wrote the dang book on surviving the outdoors, and I don't mean that figuratively either, he really wrote a book. There's a cathartic satisfaction to watching how these videos play out. The way this guy wordlessly and methodically gathers ingredients and materials to craft functional tools and livable spaces. His stoic demeanour gives him a similar kind of meticulous appeal to Jeff in Le Samurai, the silent master whose raw skill is made apparent through the calculated nature of his actions alone, lending him a sense of care and precision to his work that creates the illusion of control over his environment. All of the fat of the process is shaved clean off, leaving us only the most important information cut together in short, digestible videos that give a sense of smoothness and coherence to the process. Truthfully, I don't know how many of the average viewers actually understand what's going on. I know I don't, but we just live vicariously through John and experience the fantasy of being at one with the harsh sublime of nature. And for a time, you get this same impression from Scavengers Reign. When Sam and Ursula are first introduced in episode 1, you can really see them channeling John Plant's methodical YouTube survival guides. But there's a slightly morbid element to it this time around, which immediately sets it apart. We watch as they carve into the flesh of some unknown beast's belly, and after rummaging around in its insides like Luke Skywalker with a tauntaun, they locate 2 bioluminescent orbs in its guts. Clacking them together, they've got themselves a natural lighting source. But that sense of harmony feels at odds with the unsettling gross-out factor at play here. There's a raw grotesquerie to this process, every unpleasant movement accentuated by the visceral squelching of its oozing, writhing tissue. And as they walk away into the dense forest, we look back upon the creature they just harvested. Its utter indifference to their coming and going, despite the invasive procedure, is a warning sign for just how little this planet cares about our survivors and how little they can affect change upon it. It doesn't take long for Scavengers Reign to subvert this dynamic and upheave that sense of environmental mastery. Our characters are walking on a razor's edge here, and the wider world they inhabit is fickle, but we'll get back to that. We watch as they pluck these odd, squid-like creatures from the ceiling of a small cave. They joke about whether they could claim the last 2 months as overtime.
I know, it's fun. But seriously.
This is the first time we find out how long they've actually been here, and can only imagine the frustrating trial and error that led them to being able to navigate this small part of the world with such deftness. the kind of frustrating legwork that usually doesn't go mentioned in the YouTube tutorials that inspired the show. But the invasive, uncomfortable bent that we saw in the previous scene is cranked up just a little. They pry open their cave squids, revealing their wet insides with a pained squeal. "God, I hate it here," says Sam, as they attach the creatures to their face, the tendrils penetrating their nostrils, a makeshift ventilator of the worst, most fleshy kind. I focus on these unpleasant details so much because they're important. They deprive the audience of the same kind of vicarious catharsis that we get watching John Plant and his primitive technology videos. For every satisfying crunch of branch or clack of stone, Scavengers Reign invades the viewer's eyes and ears with sickening details that make us not want to experience this kind of survivalism vicariously. Ursula and Sam push deep into the recesses of a cave. The floor is ornamented with bizarre, asymmetrical lumps like the walls of a whale's stomach. Puffs of ambiguous, noxious gas form a hostile miasma in the air. As Sam's bioluminescent orb begins to fade, he tosses it to one side, its dim light revealing the haggard corpse of a crash survivor. Their body has become a host to a slew of fungi that permeate their flesh, bulging out of their eye socket and erupting out of their ruined skin. I guess this is what the ventilators are for. As we continue to peruse the halls into the crashed escape vessel by which the cave was carved out, we see more of these cadavers. The show quietly attacks you with acute mycophobia, really the most morbid depictions of mushrooms growing out of human flesh as you could possibly imagine. Here we see first-hand examples of those for whom the dynamic between man and the sublime force of nature was less favourable. The 2 months of trial and error that kept Ursula and Sam alive this long did not come cheap, and represents the ruthless pendulum of nature that could just as easily devour you as it can provide sustenance. Nevertheless, our two heroes push forward, locating a charged battery inside the pod and taking their leave the way they came. But they're stopped by the sound of a raspy groan. It sounds human. That can't be possible. No one could survive in these conditions. Ursula instinctively steps back and is tripped by an ambiguous lump of tissue that expands and contorts, bulging outwards into what resembles a human face. What is this thing? Was it a person once? Is any of this really happening? Ursula kicks the mass square in the eye, and it explodes into a puff of hazardous spores. As Ursula continues to hyperventilate, her makeshift gas mask begins to rapidly deplete. It drops to the ground with a wet thud. The clear and present danger of the situation becomes palpable. Images of the exposed corpses flood the viewer's minds as we clock the horror in Ursula's eyes. The two attempt to make their escape with some other makeshift solution that they've trial and errored their way into. It seems like the damage is done though. At this point, any illusion our heroes had mastery over this place has utterly dissolved. A horrifying sequence of raw body horror ensues, every inch of her body breaking out into pulpy masses of fungi and foliage. It cuts to black. Ursula gasps. We snap back to reality, just in time for Ursula to regain her senses and escape the cavern. This sequence is extremely important. This is the point in Scavengers Reign where the writers show you their hand. It's the point where the Kantian idea of the sublime, that complexity of nature that evades both mastery and true understanding, comes into the foreground. Ursula and Sam avoided the consequences this time, but the razor's edge they're walking on is undeniable. Just how quickly and easily their grasp of this world can collapse and result in the most brutal and torturous penalties is horrific. But that sense of the lack of mastery is always there from the offset. The biggest difference between Scavengers Reign and the kinds of YouTube survivalist tutorials that inspired it is that the latter takes place entirely within our own world, and the former does not. Even if primitive technology provides minimal information to the viewer, there is still a basic amount that we can infer. We live in this world, we're familiar, if only in passing, with its mechanisms. We can understand the basic ideas at play in any one of his videos. With Scavengers Reign, we really don't have that. This world is totally alien. The characters themselves may have become acquainted with it after a couple of months of being stranded, and watching them carve their way through its logic is oddly amusing. But that sense of amusement is constantly balanced out by the sense of confusion that keeps us at an arm's length. Every bit of these YouTube-esque sequences is a total surprise to us, so alien and fascinating, but a complete refusal by the writers to allow us, not just the characters but us, a sense of understanding over this place. When Sam pulls out that weird fish thing, there's really no way to know that he's going to shove his fist down its gullet, pull on its something, and use it as a balloon to levitate his way out of the spore's area of effect. I mean, even YouTube videos have a thumbnail and a title to tell you what they're about, but when we see two people climb into the belly of an unknown creature to go fishing in its internal organs, we have absolutely no idea what's happening. There's no thesis, no one says, let's go get something to use as a light source. It's unknowable. To repeat the previous quote, it's the independence of nature whose sheer complexity and grandeur continuously exceeds any human ability to control or understand it. That is the sublime. There's something kind of beautiful in all this, though. I think that's the ultimate trick of Scavengers Reign, after all. Its capacity to be both horrifying and stunning in equal measure. Sometimes we get both in the same scene. In this case, I'd like to refer to another scene from later on in Scavengers Reign, also concerning Ursula and Sam, in episode 3. I'm really trying my best to pick examples from earlier in the show because I really don't want to spoil too much for you guys. I really think you should just go watch the show, but in either case, episode 3, titled The Wall, plays even harder into these complex, grand objects which acutely terrify us for their complete incomprehensibility. The episode comes in swinging with some really opaque, evocative imagery. A bird falls from off-screen, hitting the dirt and leaving a small radius of blood around it. Its exposed ribcage sits protruding from the bird's corpse. What follows is a brief time-lapse. Its flesh decays, and its bones grow like trees from the ground, unusual fruit-like sacs hanging from its branches. This seems at once oddly familiar and totally alien. It evokes images in the viewer's mind of similar time-lapses, animal carcasses turning into fertilizer as flowers sprout from the mud where its body used to be, but then the bizarre phenomenon of the bones themselves emerging outward into these rigid, almost coral structures completely defies our understanding. A slug-like creature slithers towards the bone tree, swallowing up one of its fruity sacs, and is promptly attacked by another, larger bird. The cycle of life. We're spat in media res in a conversation between Ursula and Sam as they traverse this bizarre, cavernous desert. As they venture deeper, these weird bone trees become larger and more frequent until they stop. We see Ursula's reaction before we see anything else. A look of total bewilderment. They look up. Before them stands a wall. Who knows how deep? Who knows how long? The composition of the shot robs us of this information. All we can see is that it stretches further than our eyes can process, disappearing into the shadows of the cavern. Our survivors stand before it, completely and totally dwarfed by its horrifying majesty. Whatever mysteries this wall hides, we aren't worthy of knowing. The natural composition of this structure is all the more mystifying. A moment ago, these calcified tendrils looked like trees, shooting upwards and outwards like thick white bamboo, but here, now, bunched together in this dense slab, they look like something else. They look like veins, only no blood courses through them. Sam responds in the only way a human being could when presented with this kind of phenomena.
Whoa. Shit.
Vijay Mishra, a prominent writer on the topic of the sublime in Gothic horror, calls upon Kant once more, stating that the effects of the sublime are the consequence of the mind's confrontation with an idea too large for expression, too self-consuming to be contained in any adequate form of representation, but which idea, in a momentary surrender of the law of reason, the mind nonetheless grasps. The sublime constructs an unnameable dread that threatens subjectivity itself. That's a lot to dump on you all at once, so let's unpack it a bit as we go forward into the rest of the scene. This moment right here, where Sam and Ursula come face to face with the wall, this is what Mishra is talking about when he says an idea too large for expression, something which demands the surrender of reason because it simply cannot be grasped in logical means, something so great, so abjectly dreadful, that it threatens subjectivity itself. I've thrown that word around a couple of times now, subjectivity. But what do I actually mean by that in this case? Well, subjectivity is your sense of self, your individual internal sense of being. The idea is that when confronted with these unknowable, impossibly grand phenomena, we begin to feel insignificant. We're forced to contend in some vague sense with how fragile and unimportant we really are, how little we matter, how indifferent the wider world is to our existence. The logical faculties by which we make sense of the world have to be left behind, and without those logical faculties, we're nothing before the grandeur of the sublime. As Ursula and Sam desperately and unsuccessfully try to make sense of the wall, one of those birds emerges from its veins. It shoots off, one of its feathers breaking free and falling to the dust in its wake. Sam attempts to reason with the wall. If a bird, approximately as big as they are, could make it through, then there must be a way to the other side. He can see tracks, so it has to be possible. But Ursula, on the other hand, is transfixed by this feather the creature left behind. It's iridescent, shimmering luminous colours that warp and shift as she moves it in her hands. As she walks closer to the wall, it appears to respond to the presence of this feather, defying the bony, almost concrete properties of its own structure. A vein stretches outward to meet the feather. As the two touch, the veins part to form a path. But as they push forward, deeper into its unforeseeable arteries, it begins to close behind them, and it becomes a rush to the exit. Sam is spat out onto the other side, but something catches Ursula's eye. As Sam watches her be swallowed up by the wall, we see it, a light, emanating from something. Ursula steps closer to identify it. The source of the light appears to be this stub poking upwards. It's almost like every vein of this labyrinthine structure leads to this point. It pulsates gently with some ineffable heartbeat, and then it blooms. This is the point where the unimaginable, alienating, indescribable structure of calcified matter and irrational shapes comes to life. The stamen opens outwards, revealing the glowing core. Then the stamen stretches inwards again like tendrils, plucking the glowing bulbs from the centre one by one, releasing them into the atmosphere to hover majestically. Ursula is transfixed, and so are we. But then, protruding from the loamy surface of the flower's core, a small pea-like abscess. A tendril unearths it, revealing this minuscule, frog-like creature. The creature is released, and it opens its eyes for the first time. For one of the first times in the show to this point, this creature doesn't seem like any part of it could, or even would, cause our heroes horrific bodily harm. It just kind of stands there, dumbfounded, like a baby. It's new to the world. As though by pure instinct, it points upwards to one of the glowing orbs floating in stasis around the flower. One of the tendrils responds to its call and pulls the orb out of the sky. The creature pushes the loamy granules to one side, and beneath them, an oddly man-made looking pattern, like an architectural engraving or even a lock on the door of some space-age contraption. The creature takes the orb, pops it between its hands, and from it, a star-shaped seedling floats downwards. It comes to meet the indentation in the surface and slots satisfyingly into place. The creature presses down on it like a button, releasing a wave of light that pulls all of the glowing orbs back into place, and then it just collapses to the ground. Its colour washes out, and its breathing becomes steady and laboured. Ursula, in a moment of oneness with this indescribable process she's just witnessed, begins to breathe along, as though she's experiencing the raw presentness of life itself. The previously bone-like structure begins to pulsate around them, like an enormous lung. The creature's breathing slowly stops. It is buried by the tendrils of the flower. The petals close, the light fades. Ursula's lip quivers and her eyes well up, moved by whatever it is she just saw. When Ursula returns from the wall to a panicked and confused Sam, she is unable to explain the phenomenon. To quote Mishra once again, the things that men know, that are contained within, yet explicable, known and yet not known, such as the idea of death, signify that sense of boundlessness and indeterminacy that threatens the definition of the subject. In short, death is the abyss of the sublime. In other words, within the sublime there are ideas which we can only ever hope to vaguely comprehend in some esoteric sort of way, but never truly understand. The way I always like to put it is that these are concepts which we feel more so than we understand them. Our inability to truly make sense of them threatens the definition of the subject. It threatens our sense of importance in the grand scheme of things. But does this scene actually make you feel threatened? Mishra calls death the abyss of the sublime, but this whole sequence isn't just death. Death is a part of it, but it's also life. It's the entirety of life condensed into one short, indescribable moment that defies our ability to completely understand what's going on, but which we still kind of get. And that's beautiful, isn't it? That beauty, to me, will always be the other side of the sublime, and it's that combination of abject fear and beauty that lend Scavengers Reign its potency. Philip Shaw writes that, in recent years, some attempt has been made to reappraise the beautiful, to regard it not merely as a weaker sister figure, but as a just counter-spirit to the violent encroaches of the sublime. In this scene, with the wall and the flower, we get both. After all, the sublime can summarily be described as an encounter with that which exceeds our comprehension, that can be at once horrifying and beautiful. And truthfully, I don't think you need to look too hard at Scavengers Reign to feel that complex interconnectivity between the beauty and the fear of the sublime. Its art direction alone captures this brilliantly. If we were to look, for example, at the concept art of Jean Juarez, we can feel this in full force, and it translates fully to the show itself. Juarez's work is befitting of this general ethos of Scavengers Reign. Large, beautiful vistas depicting alien worlds. The landscapes themselves are wondrous and beautiful and scenic, wrapped up in such an expressive, saturated colour palette. But amidst these worlds, there's always a person. Small, insignificant. They're not depicted as the masters of these realms, or even necessarily the subjects of the paintings themselves. They occupy centre framing, but not in a way that imbues them with power. On the contrary, they're dwarfed by the massive, dense wilderness that surrounds them. Under a different lens, you might even be tempted to say that there's an oppressive atmosphere to the beauty of this work. And with that, I think I've said enough. I don't want to spoil this show for anyone. It still has many, many mysteries that I haven't even begun to unpack or describe. I didn't even get into Cayman or Ozzy or any of that, but you could pick any shot from this show and the ideas of the sublime that I've talked about in this video are all there. The imposing terror, the natural beauty, and the threatened subject, caught unwittingly between it all. I think it's kind of ironic that there actually was a time when showrunners Joe Bennett and Charles Huttner were considering making an episode which focused entirely on the world itself and removed the presence of its characters entirely. And while I think that would have been interesting in a vacuum, I also think it would have been an unwise choice to make, and I'm glad that they didn't go in that direction. I think that in order for the subject to be threatened, or bewildered, or absorbed into the beauty and horror of the sublime, the subject needs to be there to begin with, always a part of the formula, but never truly fitting in or belonging. And I guess that is all I have to say about Scavengers Reign. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more video essays from me. And if you've seen Scavengers Reign, what did you think of it? Let me know in the comments below. But until next time, I'm Tom, this is Curmudgeon Media, and I'll see you in the next one.